In this video, we're going to be talking everything lenses. This video is going to be geared toward the beginner photographer or filmmaker, as all my videos are up until this point. In this video, we're going to be talking about how to identify and classifying some different lenses that are out there on the market so we can better understand what we're looking at. As well, I'm going to be giving you guys my recommendation at the end of the video for what lens you should have in your kit based on the type of work you're doing. In my opinion, the lens is more important than the particular camera you're using. While there is a baseline for performance you want to be able to get out of your camera, if I had a certain amount of money to spend on a camera and lens kit, I would definitely be spending the majority of the money on the lens, or focusing at least more on selecting a good lens and then using whatever's left over in my budget to purchase the camera that can go with that lens. So what do all these markings mean on the lens? The first thing we're going to look at is the focal length of the lens. This is measured in millimeters. This one right here is a 17 to 28 millimeter. What this refers to is the focal length, or the field of view on the lens, or in other words, how much zoom this lens has. A 17 millimeter lens is a wide lens. A 28 is going to be a little bit tighter than that. If we went up to 50 or 70, we're continuing to get more and more tight and zooming in more based on that millimeter length. So that's kind of what we have to think about here. Is when I look at 17 to 28, I know that this is a wide angle lens. If I look at this one over here, that's a 58 millimeter. I know that this one's going to be a lot tighter, a lot more zoomed in than this one will be. The next thing we're going to look at is the aperture on the lens. On a photography lens like this, you're going to see it measured in f-stops. This one right here says f2.8. That means this is a fixed aperture and the widest it will go is 2.8, which is pretty good in my mind. If you're using something like this, which is a cinema lens, it will be measured in t-stops rather than f-stops. They're pretty similar. I'm not going to get into any of the specifics with it, but as you can see, this one's a t2.9. So that is the widest this particular lens can go. Now, one of the big differences to point out between these two lenses right here, one that is a manual lens made for cinema or more narrative video type projects, and then one that is an electronic lens that is made for more toward photography. On this lens right here, your aperture is not going to be adjusted with a wheel that you manipulate on the actual lens. It's going to be adjusted through your camera. So that is something to note. A lens like this usually also has autofocus in it, whereas a manual lens will not have autofocus, and you're going to need to manually turn these rings on it in order to adjust your aperture and adjust your focus. Another big difference between these two lenses, this one 17 to 28, and this one is a 35 millimeter. This one is a variable lens, or a zoom lens, meaning I can adjust it from 17 millimeters up to 28 millimeters. This one is fixed at 35 millimeters. This is what we call a prime lens. It does not have any other focal lengths. It's just a 35 millimeter, and it is a manual lens. Generally speaking, a good prime lens is going to be cheaper and usually perform a little better and have a wider aperture than an equivalent priced zoom lens. However, usually zoom lenses are preferred because they are really convenient. For the type of work I'm doing, at least, I use zoom lenses or variable lenses a lot because I am doing run and gun type video. I'm doing fast stuff where it needs to get done right now, and I'm not so much setting up for a shot or doing any of the cinematography stuff. It's more of the videography. I'm on a gimbal or I'm handheld, and I am trying to capture stuff very quickly as it's happening. That is where the zoom lens comes in, because it gives me a lot of versatility. I don't have to swap lenses to get different shots. On certain lenses out there, specifically certain zoom lenses, you have what's called a variable aperture instead of a fixed aperture like this Tamron. It says f2.8. On some lenses that are a little bit cheaper, you will see f4 to 5.6. Now, what that means is the lower number or the larger aperture is for your lower magnification on that lens or your lower focal length. So if this was an f4 to 5.6, that means on the lower end at 17 millimeters, it would be an f4 at its widest. And then when I go up to 28, it would be f5.6 at its widest. So as you zoom in on it, the aperture will actually close down. If you are at f4, it will close down to f5.6. Typically, lenses with a variable aperture are going to be a little bit cheaper, and a lot of times they can have better focal ranges. So you might see something that's like a 24 to 105, whereas typically in a fixed aperture, you won't see that wide range. It might be a 24 to 70 for your standard range. But what it doesn't have in focal length, it makes up for in the aperture. A lot of times, people who are shooting video professionally like myself, we prefer to have something that is at least 2.8 or better when it comes to our lenses. So I prefer a fixed aperture. That way, when I expose my shot for whatever scene it is, maybe I'm shooting an event outdoors, I've already set my exposure. I would like to bounce in and out between different focal lengths without having to re-expose my shot or having the shot underexposed as I zoom in. Some of the other markings you'll see on lenses on here may just be the model number, basically describing, what kind of glass they're using in it. You may also see something on the Sony lenses like OSS, which is image stabilization. A lot of different zoom lenses or even prime lenses might have image stabilization built in, and those are specific to manufacturers. So you're really going to have to look that up, some of those markings, just to find out what they use to describe image stabilization. You might also see autofocus on there. Things like that you're going to see on here. One of the other ones that you'll notice that is pretty popularly on lenses also is the thread pitch for the objective. Basically, it's going to tell you what size filters you need to use if you wanted to thread on a filter to your lens. On this Tamron lens, it's actually on the side, and it has a little circle with a slash through it, and it says 67 millimeters. So on here, it lets me know it is a 67 millimeter objective thread pitch, so I know what size filters to get. On other lenses, it is going to be on the front of the lens, like on this Sirui anamorphic lens right here. This one says 58 millimeters. That's the size of the thread pitch right here that I need if I'm going to get a filter for this. This one's also cool. It also shows the minimum focal range, which is 0.9 meters or 3 feet on it. And since it's anamorphic, it shows me the squeeze ratio on it, which is 1.6x on this particular lens. One of the last things you may want to look for, especially if you're buying a lens in the store, is it may actually show you what mounting system it's for. So on the Sirui right here, toward the mount, it says E-mount. On the Tamron, it says it on the cap, it says E-mount. So I know, since I'm using a Sony camera that is using E-mount, that these lenses will be compatible with my camera. So that is something important to check to make sure the lens will actually fit. And if it doesn't, like this old Helios 44-2 lens, you may need to get an adapter like what I have on here. And you could simply look that up online, an adapter for whatever your mount is. Let's say it's M42 to E-mount, and usually you can pick something up like this for reasonable price online. Before we jump into what I would recommend for lenses for you guys, we need to talk about one other thing that's going to be very important when it comes to the focal length you're going to get out of these lenses. And that is the size of the sensor in your camera. I'm using a Sony FX3, which has a full frame sensor. That means that if I'm using a full frame lens, a lens that has light coverage that would cover a full frame sensor, that these millimeter ranges, the focal range on this, is accurate for my particular camera. But if you're using an APS-C, also known as a Super 35 sensor, or a Micro Four Thirds sensor, you're going to have a crop factor with your lens. So if your camera is not a full frame camera, I would definitely recommend figuring out what size sensor you have and looking it up online and asking what the crop factor is for your camera. For example, an APS-C sensor on Sony cameras is typically somewhere around 1.6x crop on these focal ranges here. Even if you get a specific lens for your APS-C camera, the focal length is going to be written as if it were a full frame lens. So what that means is essentially if you have a 20mm lens for your APS-C camera and you have a, let's say, a 1.5x crop on it, that is now equivalent to a 30mm lens. So you have basically a 1.5 zoom on your lens. So keeping that in mind, when I recommend a lens for you guys here, we are talking about the full frame equivalent value for that lens. What do I recommend for you guys? Well, if you're like me and you started shooting real estate, I would recommend a wide angle lens, something with a large aperture. This could be a prime lens, it could be a zoom lens like what I have here. This is the Tamron 17-28 f2.8. I would definitely recommend something within that about 14 to 18mm range for real estate because it's really important to get those wide angles. Maybe you're somebody who's doing a lot of portrait photography. A popular lens for a lot of portrait photographers is an 85mm prime lens, something that's got autofocus in it you can be fast with and have that focal length that's gonna make people look really natural and pleasing. Now, if you're like me and you're doing a lot of run and gun work, let's say you're doing a lot of the social media work, you're doing product photography, you're recording events and things like that, I would recommend a standard zoom lens. This would be like what I have right here, the Sigma 24-70 f2.8. That is absolutely perfect for most people doing most types of work out there. If you're not quite sure what you need, this is the lens I would recommend, the Sigma 24-70 f2.8. I have the art version of it. You can find equivalent focal lengths with about the same aperture. Maybe it's a variable aperture, but depending on what you're doing, the variable aperture may not really matter. And if it doesn't really matter to you, then you could save a couple bucks and get a variable aperture version, probably with a wider range. You see a lot of the 24 to 105s that are f4 to f5.6. If you're usually filming with light or outdoors a lot, that variable aperture may not really matter a whole lot to you, and that may be something that works out well for you. So those are my recommendations for you guys, and that is kind of my starter's guide on lenses. Hopefully this is a good starting point for you. If you don't really know much about lenses, I hope you learned something and you had something to take away from this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Leave any questions or comments below. Thank you so much. God bless.